Namaste. So, at part of the series on writings of Sri Aurobindo, we are reading portions from essays on the Gita. So as we see, the Gita can be put into different sections. The first two sections basically are about, primarily, the first section is about Arjuna's dilemma and Shri Krishna's rebuke. And in that rebuke, he also gives a very interesting logic about very rational. It's a very rational philosophical work, the Gita. That's why it has such a great appeal to the modern mind. Though it contains the profoundest spiritual wisdom and the path, but it proceeds very rationally and it tells Arjuna that you are a Kshatriya, it's your Swadharma to fight, and either you will fall nobly or conquer and enjoy the kingdom. So, this was a very proper aim for a Kshatriya. But avoiding the fight was not the option. And then it describes that life and death are nothings, which is so true. Even rationally it explains, if there is nothing which survives death, then why, make such a to-do about it? And if something survives after death, then why make a to-do about it? As simple as that. Because in any case, in that case, there is the immortal soul within us. But at the same time, if there is nothing, then why you are feeling so despondent and about death, which is something natural, it's a natural process. But this is only where Gita sets the note. And then it takes us through a series of chapters where the highest spiritual wisdom of that age is brought together and synthesized. So in India, we'll see two types of spiritual thought. One is which takes an extreme specialized path, and through that path it explores the divine. But it becomes a very specialized path which slowly it gets disconnected from all other tendencies, paths, like a lonely mountain climb. But on the other side, time to time, we see these grand trunk roads and the mighty rivers which join these different, which try to synthesize. So there are these two tendencies simultaneously. For instance, we see in the Vedas, Vedas themselves are very synthetic scripture. There is a synthesis in them. And in the early Upanishads, we see that tendency. But then subsequently, when different paths of yoga came into existence, we see the tendency to specialize. But the Gita again tries to bring them together. Again, we see in Puranas, there is a tendency, this Purana, that Purana, each god is taken to his absolute. But the Tantras try to synthesize them in the great vision of the Divine Mother, Shakti. Whether you take Vishnu Purana or whether you take the Shiv Purana, either of the methods, you have to lean back upon the Divine Mother. So in Tantra, there is a synthesis of the world and God. Because they don't, they accept that world is the joy in the world, which must, the powers of the world, it must be explored fully in your way toward the divine. And then again we see that new material flows into the research laboratory called Earth, and Sri Aurobindo once again integrates it and creates a new synthesis. This tendency in India of not just all-inclusive, but second, very wide Catholic tendency, and at the third level, evolutionary process. Every time a new material comes, it takes into itself and creates something higher and greater, is its real boon. Unlike scriptures which are born at a point of time, get fixed after a certain period of time when their work is over, and then if they continue, they are either like fossils or empty shells from which spiritual truths have escaped. But in India, because of this vivifying spirit, which keeps on giving rebirth to the scriptures, or takes their essence, truth, while discarding the kernel, it's a wonderful tendency, and the Gita is a masterpiece which shows this tendency. For instance, in the Gita, in the period of the Gita, there is this too much, again, like in every age, suddenly the Vedas were being understood as, doctrinal things and ritualistic sacrifices. So every day you have the yagya, fire is lit, you do homa with the actual ghee and all that. Now, not denying its occult place, but in the Vedas you'll see that there is a tendency you have a higher paradise. There are aspects in the Veda like that. Say you go to the paradise, and that's why even in Mundaka Upanishad we see they say that the three Vedas belong to the lower knowledge. And if somebody reads it, one would wonder that what is it, what are they saying? But the higher knowledge is the knowledge of the stainless Brahman. So the Gita also at one point will say that Vedvadins, those who are busy with the ritualistic karma kand and understanding of the Vedas in this way. So the Gita doesn't amplify, but Sri Aurobindo reveals to us that what is the truth behind Sri Krishna saying that, well, those who follow these heavenly gains through the practice of the Vedas are like people in a small little vessel. They are trying to again, pick up water from a vast ocean. Whereas those who follow the path of yoga, they have the ocean itself. So it regards that practice of the Vedas ritualistically for just these otherworldly gains as something very inferior. So if one picks up this aspect, one may conclude that the Gita is actually decrying the Vedas, but it's not true. Later on, the Gita itself brings out the deeper truth of Vedas and Upanishads and reveals that. So one should be very careful in interpreting any of these great scriptures. The same thing applies to Sri Aurobindo's works. That you pick up a sentence from one place and you will make a meaningless understanding or a dogma out of it. But when you see the totality, that's why the mother said that Sri Aurobindo has to be read in totality. You have to read all that he has written on a particular subject. Then you will understand what is the main essence and the drift, which of course is not an easy task, and that's why we have things like the All India magazine. But purpose is this, because he has to read by subjects and not by books. They are mother's words. So again we see that the Gita contains within itself something very interesting. And as far as I know, it is the first scripture. There was once a little, not debate, but someone remarked about, Hindu Dharma and, though they are part of the larger Sanatan context, but there are people who try to separate because they will get advantages and separate country and all those things. So they were saying that, we don't have these gods or a murti and we worship. So I said, yes, but you worship a book. And you keep the book in some holy place which you regard as holy. And then I said that, do you know what Shri Krishna has said in the Gita about holy books? So he said, oh, what does he say? I said, he says, go beyond the scripture written or you have heard or written scripture, both you have to go beyond. Shabda Brahmati Vartate. And the logic of it is so beautiful that no scripture or all the scriptures of the world, Vedas, Upanishads, Gita, Bible, Quran, Guru Granth Sahib, take it, any book in the world, can ever contain all the infinite glories of God. Because He is infinite. It also opens the door to an evolutionary possibility, that there are new truths which will get revealed. Why do we want to close the gates of the divine at a certain point of time? So this is something very beautiful. The Gita says within itself that Shabda Brahmati Vartate, they go beyond all that you have heard, all that you have read, though it is in a certain context, but that context applies to the Gita as well. And Sri Aurobindo speaks about it. That at the end, these words are not meant for dialectical discussions. They are not meant for holding a seminar or writing a book on Gita made easy. They are meant to pick up those pearls of wisdom which can strengthen our soul, make it awake, conscious, and help us walk through this life toward the great summits. That is the purpose of the Gita. In fact, of any scripture. They are not meant for dialectical discussions that we turn them today. So, once this background is set, so we see in the Gita the various kinds of synthesis. So the first 6 chapters, it tries to synthesize Vedanta, Yoga and Sankhya. They were prevalent during that time. Then he takes us through the Gospel of Works and culminates it in devotion. And then finally this devotion he takes to the supreme secret. So it's very interesting the way the Gita develops its philosophy and the wisdom, which is so practical. So in the beginning, if we see, the Gita speaks about Sankhya. It's very interesting because Sankhya is regarded by many as a kind of atheistic philosophy. And for a reason, because it is not theism for sure. Because there is in it a Purusha, the indestructible. But he is just like a witness, luminous witness, that's it. You can't connect with him. Theistic philosophy means you connect with him. It may look like dualism, but it's not dualism because there are completely two different principles. In Dvaitavad, you have the souls are from the one, but you cannot completely fuse with the divine. You can live in a certain status in closeness of the divine like Narada. That's Dvaita. Here there are two completely different aspects. So one is about existence. So that's why Sankhya philosophy appeals a lot. Sankhya literally is about numbers, numerals. So it analyzes and discriminates, tries to understand what is the composition of a being. So what is the composition of a being? So it says that there are various components. One is that there are karmendriyas through which we act. Then there are jnanendriyas through which we receive all the information, all the sense organs and karmendriya. Then you have the panch bhut through which all matter is constituted. Science does the same thing. And these are not gross things but subtle principles. For instance, you see water, the principle that dynamic kinetic energy, that's why water is always symbolized as life. The energy which flows, that creates attractions and repulsions. You see the principle of the fire principle. It is the principle of heat and light which is inbuilt within everything. The energy, the dynamism as such. The principle of space, which is about the vast expanse in which all things are held. So it has all these space, then in space the stir starts and you have the Vayu. So Vayu is that within this vast infinite space, there is the stir of creation. Call it Nad, call it anything whatsoever. And with that stir, creation begins. Now this stir, one stir will not make any form because it will go on expanding itself infinitely. It will keep on pushing space further and further. But this stir out of itself brings out many waves, like from the ocean beds. And these waves clash and wrestle and come together, combine. So aerial principle. So when we see that there is a modification of this space itself, and you have those very early forms, but they cannot be stabilized because see, air is constantly moving, jostling, collapsing. But this is the first thing that nature does. And these forces exist, forces of attraction, repulsion, they all exist within nature. Then to give them some kind of fixity, there has to be a nucleus around which they do this. You can't have a chaotic process. So that nucleus becomes the principle of fire. So it is the nucleus around which all this movement is taking place. So you have first forms, but they are still not stable. So we have the whole atomic constitution described in these three principles. So fire starts bringing these aerial principle around it. So out of modifying the aerial principle, we have the principle of fire. Then out of fire, this cannot create stable forms. So out of fire, what is born is the principle of air is movement, and this is the principle of fluidity. So this fluid principle is the water element. So it makes it a little more viscous. The forms become a little more viscous. They try to become solid, but they are like Casper the, so they are forms which don't stay. They are not stable forms. So they are just flowing. So out of atom you have molecules, crystals, they are beginning to, So you see actually out of atoms you have molecules, but they are not stable structures, So out of that, the principle of water, there is this principle of earth. It stabilizes, fixes it. So if we really look at it, it's so beautifully, it's logical. Science speaks about these kinetic energy, potential energy, forces of weak attraction and strong attraction. Then the electromagnetic impulsion, which is like the fire principle inside. And then finally, the gravitational force or the force of cohesion, which is the earth principle. It stabilizes, fixes forms. So when we understand it, so logical. So Sankhya is a very logical system. But then that's Prakriti. So you have these five indriyas through which you receive, five indriyas through which you act. It creates for each aspect, you have an indriya which receives it. So for the sound aspect, you have the ear, aerial aspect. So it manifests as sound and you have the ear to receive it. For fire, you have the sight. So you see, you receive that light and energy comes through that. Then for the principle of water, again you have the taste. And then for the earth, you have the smell and touch. So this is how the entire thing proceeds, which is so logical. Then you have to create individuality. Sankhya was analyzing, but how are individuals formed? All this is okay, but this is happening all around in creation. How are individuals formed? So it brings in these three things. Mano, Buddha, Ahankar, Chitta, Ninadam. You remember that Sankaracharya's phrase. So you have the principle of mind, Mana. Then you have the principle of Buddhi, the discerning intellect. It's in Sankhya, it is part of nature. So, man is, these senses are creating an impression somewhere. So, there is a hub where they are creating an impression, and out of that, there is a perception of objects. And then the Buddhi, the intellect which discerns what these objects are. So, you have the man, Buddhi, and then the sense of I, which comes through Ahankar. And then it went on to say that nature itself operates through three modes of nature, and it's same thing we see in material science. Forces of tamas, rajas, and sattva. So tamas force is there in atom, first law of Newton, law of inertia is there in atom. That's how things get fixed. Force of rajas, kinetic energy, movement. Force of equilibrium and balance. So every atomic structure has a tendency to find its equilibrium. So if you see, it's so logical actually. When you read Sankhya, what is left to really explain? But then who is experiencing all this? So it brought in the element of the Purusha. He is the witness. So what is the relation between Purusa and Prakriti? The Purusha may be involved in nature and experience itself as a mutable being. Or the Purusha may come out of nature and become the witness. So these are the two possibilities of the Purusha. Purusha is not Purusha the way we understand, but that selfhood, if we want to put it. So when it is involved, and the same thing we see in the Upanishad Dvasuparna. One bird which is eating the fruits and the other one who is watching from above. This reminds me of a little joke as an aside, how these things can be misunderstood. So in long back in Patiala, maybe 30 years back. So I was talking about this Dvasuparna from the Upanishad. So there was a man. What that intelligence must be, whatever. But after hearing Dvasuparna that there are two birds, one is eating the fruit, the other is watching. So he asked me, sir, I have a question. I said, yes, please tell me. He said, sir, वो जो चिड़िया ऊपर बैठी है, दिल तो उसका भी करता होगा खाने का. That bird also must be wanting to eat. I said, if it wants to eat, it will no more be that bird. It will become this bird. It will enter into this status. So he said, Acha, very nice, big Acha. So these are the two poises we can adopt. One is what is called as Anumanta. Anumanta is whatever nature is doing, it's science. Senses are driving us, we are driven in that direction. Anumanta. Soul's consent is needed for every act, Sri Aurobindo says in Savitri. But it's like an indifferent witness, signing. Okay, whatever nature says, I'm taking you there, okay, sign. It's like a blind king who is signing every edict. Dhritarashtra. Everybody takes his permission. But whatever Duryodhana says, Shakuni says, he ends up signing blindly. So, Anumanta, this is the first status of the soul, according to one understanding. And the other is Sakshi, when it becomes a witness. It says, nature will go on its own way, but I am a witness. Now, this is the first step in yoga. And Sri Aurobindo says that it's a very powerful step. The mother uses the term step back. And if you read the synthesis of yoga, Sri Aurobindo starts with this. And if you do that, just observe nature. And mother says, don't judge. If you judge, you will be drawn into it. Good, bad, then you will be drawn to, oh, this is good, I must hold. This is bad, I must suppress. Then you're caught. Both good and bad conceptions will catch you in the play. The mother says they prevent offering also. Because, you don't want to see the bad things. So you see them in others. You can't see in yourself. Bad is for others, good is for me. So they prevent. But when the Purusha is completely involved in it, it experiences life like that. So therefore there is duality. This is good, this is bad. Based on, how it experiences. There is suffering, there is pleasure and pain. All this it experiences. When it becomes a witness, it sees the whole play of nature. So first thing is to watch this whole play without judging. And if we watch it and are no more the Anumanta. Anumanta is somebody who indifferently sanctions. So if we no more act as an Anumanta, then after a while the tendency or the habit begins to become weaker and weaker and weaker. First step of yoga. So that's why Shri Krishna says, you are caught in moha, practice Sakshi Bhav. It will become weaker and weaker and weaker. So you'll see a tendency just going down. But it's not like in one day, 6 months, if you pick up one tendency, or entire field of nature. And this leads to liberation. Very first step. So this liberation prepares us for a greater action in the world. Rather, because many people say, okay, if there is no Anumanta, you are just a witness, how will you act? The yogin will become powerless man. But the Gita says, no, his action will be far more powerful. Yogaha karmashu kausalam. Because he is no more moved by raga, dvesha, desires, etc. So he'll be moved in a much more powerful way. I think the other day somebody had put this beautiful quote from Sri Aurobindo's Essays, Human and Divine. The ideal yogin is no pent-up force. He acts in the world much more powerfully and integrally than so this idea of the cave-dwelling yogi who has become, just redundant is not the way Indian yoga conceived it. But this is the first step, to become a Sakshi. But Sankhya stops here. But the Gita see how it synthesizes. It says, but yoga is greater. This is important, necessary. There are other finer elements like Sankhya believes in multiplicity of souls because it otherwise cannot explain. If there is only one self, then if one person ever withdrew, everybody should be liberated. Also, everybody should experience life in the same ways. Look how logically they went. But we don't. So there is multiplicity of souls. But it could never explain it, why, how it came into existence. So Sankhya says we are just discerning, analyzing and stating facts. That's it. Why, what is not our business. This was Sankhya. Complete division between Purusa and Prakriti. So the yoga was just Purusa should withdraw and become a Sakshi. So the Gita takes us one step further. What is the yoga? It says, when you have thus withdrawn, you have Anumanta and Sakshi. Now you have to go to the third level. Become Isha. So Sri Aurobindo in the synthesis speaks about Anisha. Anish is the indifferent signature. He doesn't have the light. Anisha is not Lord. So though he is supposed to be the Lord, we see these lines in Savitri in the issue, where Sri Aurobindo says that nature's instrument crowns himself her king. So right now we are tossed and carried across by nature. But there comes a time when we are freed and then we become king. So this way Gita brings in the element of yoga. He says, yes, first two steps are right, but there is something you have missed out. There is the great being. So that atheistic philosophy of Sankhya, atheistic not the way we understand, that there is nothing but material. It says there is a Purusha, but atheistic in the sense it doesn't believe in a being or a God to whom we can turn. So it's regarded as atheistic. So it says, no, there is this great being. And we can turn to this great being and become fully, our mind should be absorbed in him. So the Gita says that unless you do it, you will never become completely free, which is so true. If we become only a witness, this can go to any absurd extent. You can't act in the world. I mean, in one of the Sri Aurobindo Bhavan in Bangalore, there's a man who was supposed to be, watch over things. So we had nice, in Alsur Bhavan center. So there were nice chandan sandalwood trees. And you're not supposed to cut them because they all belong to the state. You cannot cut without permission of the state. They fix the price, everything. You can't just cut and sell it. So one day we went in the morning and saw trees are gone. So we asked this man who used to be there in the evening, said, what happened? He said, I know, they have been cut by some thieves who came. You saw them? Yes. So what were you doing? I was witnessing. This is not what witnessing means. So you see, misapplication of truth is I was a witness. I said, be a witness to yourself. But this is how people understand. So the perfect release doesn't come just by witnessing. You have to go to the next level. To be the Ish, you must be one with the Ish. So the next great step is to be completely devoted in the mind. The mind must turn toward the eternal. So the Gita speaks of the three Purushas. These are all the initial chapters that I'm speaking of. So the three Purushas, which is another very unique aspect of the Gita. You have the Sharobhav. Sharobhav is the same in the mutable. You are just Anumanta, Anish. It's there. You are involved in it. Of course the soul is there, but completely involved in nature. Sharobhav. Shar, why? Because it's mutable. This world which is totally changing, transient, anityam, asukham, and yet the Purusha ties itself to it. Mutable. So it experiences constant flux and flow of nature. Yet it is Purusha, but it is in this bhav, Shar Purush. So the Gita says, higher than the Shar Purush is Akshara Brahma Paramam. Akshara. That which doesn't fall. Its status is forever the same. That is higher than the Sharobhav. So we have the mutable state of the Purusha and the immutable in which it enters. Once it enters, it cannot fall from there. So this is the Akshar Bhav. There was another very funny story about it, about Dara. So Dara, Sheikh Ibrahim, he would sit and watch, and one day somebody went into his room, saw Dara with 2 cigarettes in hand and mosquito repellent in the feet together. That's how he would, sit for meditation and be a witness. He had that capacity. Not about cigarette, but about witnessing. So this man sees there is a thief who, his window is open. He puts the hook up. He has got a nice hook on a nice little rod, bamboo. So with that hook, his shirt could be seen from below. So he puts the hook, takes the shirt, brings it down. And this man is watching. Because he has entered the room, so this man is seeing this happen, and Dara is also sitting there. He is behind Dara, and he sees this event happen. Then he thought Dara will react, but Dara says nothing. Then the second shot also goes. Then it tells Dara. He says, yes, I am watching. So what are you doing? I am just wondering how brilliant, intelligent the man. So you see, it does give you a release to an extent, even foolishly when you do it. All that, ups and downs and reacting to things, that doesn't happen. So, but Akshar Brahm, beyond the Akshara, there is the Uttama Purusha. This is the highest status that is possible for the soul. That is the Purushottama. What is Purushottama? He holds the Shar and the Akshar both within himself. That's why he is not separate. He is distinct and yet he holds both of them. So you have the Sharobhav and the Akshar and the Uttam Purusha who holds the two states. Meaning thereby, if we have to use the language of the yoga, he is a person who can enter into the mutable, he can enter into the immutable. And yet he is superior to them. He is superior to all the contexts of nature, but he can engage into the play. Then only you can. If you are either caught in the play or you are separate, you need a third state, and that third state is to dwell in the Purushottama. One cannot become Purushottama, but one can dwell in the Purushottama. By dwelling in the Purushottama, one can enter into the mutable and the immutable at will. So one is truly free. That is the state of Jivan Mukta, towards which the Gita takes us. So it says that yoga is greater. And then he says, Arjuna, I consider knowledge greater than works. So I say, sir, now I am totally confused. My question is to kill or not to kill. You tell me one thing. I don't know. Now you are telling that intelligence into this is higher, knowledge is greater than action. So what am I supposed to do? Gather knowledge. Then Shri Krishna explains to him what is knowledge. Because we think by knowledge you have to renounce and therefore know. So he gives the distinction between Tyaga and Sannyas. He says, yes, knowledge is first. Because if you act without knowledge, you will be foolish. Knowledge must be the base on which action must be based. How to gather knowledge? So traditionally, because why Arjuna is asking? Because the traditional idea is to get knowledge, you have to go to the Himalayas, meditate upon a forest, you have to abandon works. So he says you don't have to abandon works to gain knowledge. So what are we supposed to do? You have to change yourself inwardly to gain knowledge while being engaged in works. So Arjuna says, what are we supposed to do? What do you mean? So he explains what is known as the yoga of the intelligent will. So this is how the Sankhya and the yoga are brought together. So what is the intelligent will in man? It is everybody. We all have a little bit of intelligence and we all have a little bit of will. But where is it diverted? It is all the time driven by desires, by the senses. So the intelligent will gets bewildered. So the Gita describes the image of the Ratha. You have the steeds, which are the senses. Then you have the rein, which is the mind. Mind holds these senses, the sixth sense. And then you have the charioteer who is holding the rein itself. That is the Buddhi, the discerning intellect. And then you have the Rathi, the great self. So it says this is the hierarchy of beings. Now imagine the charioteer just not pulling the reins, saying, let the horses go in whatever direction. Now when a man is driven like that, it becomes, he will be lost and bewildered and confused. He won't even know where the steeds are taking him. And therefore great loss will come to him. He will lose the memory of the self. And with that there is great perdition. On the other hand, if he holds the reins and the senses and decides where it should go, where it will go is based on the directions of the Rathi, where the Rathi wants to go. So you have the full image that we have the five senses. Greater than the senses is the mind. Greater than the mind is the Buddhi. And greater than the Buddhi is the great self. So senses, nothing is to be abandoned. Senses to be controlled by the mind by the Buddhi. Buddhi itself must be at the service of the great self. So how to do that? Very simple. It says that our intelligent will has two possibilities within it. Gita is immensely practical. So what are the two possibilities? One is outward and downward. So outward is driven by the senses. Every sense contact, every action, it reacting all the time. Oh, this happened, so there is a reaction. We react on even the looks of people. Forget about looks, words, everything. We react. So when we react thus, we are being outward, based on appearances. When we react, we are driven outward. Lower, downward, when we are pulling ourselves down to, supposing somebody is angry with us. How would the mother say? If you start vibrating with the same anger, then the adverse force has succeeded. It may have occupied one person, but you have been dragged down to the same level. So your response should be a calm, collected response. Not that the person is angry, so you also start getting agitated and start, reacting. To fear, if we start vibrating to fear, the intelligent will is bewildered. It goes down, it forgets God. It says, oh my God, death is imminent before me. What can God do? It may even say that God has abandoned me. And yes, because it takes that attitude, it plunges downward and opens the doors to every kind of thing. So these are the two movements of the first movement of the intelligent will, where it is drawn to the surface and it gravitates down. So there is a very interesting incident. It actually happened to somebody, and when we are going in a car, for instance, and you see a truck or some car coming from the opposite side, which you think is going to hit you. And mother explained this very beautifully with this same example. And I have seen this happen in somebody's life. What is the natural tendency? Oh my God, you project, what's going to happen? You are killed, most likely. This is the outward projection. You see an event and you anticipate that event, and 99% you are becoming instrument to precipitate that event. Other movement is inward. Ma, Lord, that is another movement, inward. So though it will come very clear, near, it's quite likely they will pass away with a little scratch, with a little problem, little bit of damage. And even if there is an actual collision, you may just be you will be saved, and you may escape with very little injuries. Why? Because you have made this movement. I have even interviewed some people who were saved in Upahar cinema tragedy, and people who survived, at least I know some of them, they all at the last moment suddenly, whoever they had turned to, these people were all turned to Krishna. So they said, we abandoned ourselves to Krishna. They survived. One among this family of 7 which died, only one, was the one who was worried about the child. Tu kahan hai, kahan hai? The child survived. But this lady died because her consciousness was all the time about the child. So, first movement is outward and downward. Second is inward and upward. So, what is the inward shift? That before reacting to anything, step back and look at it, how important it is. What you are going to really achieve through this anger or pushing things aside, you may need to do it, but you must do it in a very calm, collected manner, not through any of the lower vibrations of hatred, anger, fear, etc. Even in that movement of slaying, the Gita would say, have compassion. So this is the upward movement. What is the highest poise from which you can act? And the mother once describes that there are 3 poises, attitude that I can take. She uses the word poises with regard to people. One is where she takes that poise of falsehood, it has to be finished. She speaks of that. And then she says, the second is of a kind of compassion at the human suffering and pain people bring to themselves. Third is, she says, it is grace without any questions. Whatever people may do or not do, it doesn't matter. And she says, that's my most natural poise. Where she just gives grace. She doesn't like, you are good, bad, why you are there, oh, there is suffering, because you are the one who chose the wrong attitude. She says, no. None of that. It's an unconditional grace which acts. It doesn't take anything into consideration. She speaks of these 3 poises. The first is the lowest, where she just destroys whatever movement is there. And her admonitions, if you really, though they are graces, yet even though it's a grace, some of them can be very strong. Somebody who is not ready to bear them can completely feel bewildered. Amal Kiran, when he was against the mother's car, he had put one of his leg there and was leaning on the back side, rear side of the car. And mother came and gave him a tight slap. Suddenly, what happened? He didn't do anything. He said, when you are on the battlefield, can you afford to be unconscious? It's mother's car. You are leaning upon it with your leg put there. What kind of state you must be in? As if, somebody is like a hero. And Amal Kiran notes that it shook me initially. Somebody would say, what's wrong with it? It's a material object. You are doing nothing. There was somebody who was sitting with both feet pointing toward the picture of Sri Aurobindo. And the mother scolded that man. Don't you know? Don't you know means you are supposed to be an Indian, you don't know how to be before the master? So this was one point. The second is where she understands they are doing it out of such ignorance. It's compassion to pull them out, explain to them all this. Third is where she says, it doesn't matter, whatever, this is human world, there are no errors, no mistakes. So this is how the divine acts in this world. And one has to become an instrument of that grace. So the Gita speaks about all this inward and upward movement of the discerning intellect or the intelligent will. So it means to be turned within in a remembrance of the divine. That's where the yoga takes this new aspect. He brings in yoga, matpara, you meditate upon me. That's how the 6 chapters toward the end he says, be devoted to me, think about me. In your mind you should be full of me. Turn within and turn above. And when we do that, then we are truly liberated. So this is the first aspect of the Gita's teaching, where it teaches the intelligent will to learn to restrain the senses and the mind and to direct them only at the behest of the higher intelligent will, and that intelligent will itself turn towards the divine. In the Sankhya, it ends with this. In fact, in Sankhya, the intelligent will is part of nature. It is the Purusha which withdraws the consent. But how does the Purusha withdraw the consent? What is there in Purusha which withdraws the consent? What makes the Purusha at one level feel its reflection in Prakriti? At another level, suddenly it withdraws consent. It doesn't explain. It just says the Purusha has to become a witness. But what is that faculty? So there we see the Gita that though Buddhi, and Sri Aurobindo says the same thing, though Buddhi is a formation of nature, it agrees, Mano Buddha Ahankar, it's a formation of nature. And yet it is the highest possibility in nature. And therefore one must use this intelligent will to turn within and upward. Through this the Purusha extracts itself out. So while it is caught in nature, there is a tool given to it. That look, if you take this tool, there is a key dropped inside. Hand it over to man. Apply this key so that you can come out of this great. And this the Gita calls as Samadhi. Says Samadhi is not about a trance in which you forget about the world. And Sri Aurobindo says that is a special condition. But the Gita's definition of Samadhi is not that. Gita's definition of Samadhi is a man who stays in this state of tranquility, inner tranquility and felicity, undisturbed by all these outer events, in a state of inner equanimity. Such a person is in Samadhi. Naturally, Arjuna says, you are telling me all these things are very difficult. Why are you telling me now? How can I practice all this now? So the Gita assures him, practice a little. Even swalpa, little bit, it will liberate you from great fear. Swalpamasya dharmasya. Just practice a little bit of it. It will liberate you from great fear. So this is the advice of the Gita, the counsel of the Divine Master to all of us. That if you practice this kind of separation, you will be released inside from many of these things, suffering. So unlike the Buddhist way, which is about eightfold path, Buddhist way comes very close to Sankhya, using a certain kind of another principle. The Gita advocates a very simple way while engaged in action. Just learn to step back, turn within, turn upward. And before acting, take the counsel of our own highest self, whatever is accessible to us. And that action dedicate to the divine. That's all that it says. So we will read some lines before I get tempted to just speak. So, okay, it defines yoga in a very interesting way, the Gita. So it says the Sankhya also is a yoga, but it proceeds by knowledge. It starts, that is to say, by intellectual discrimination and analysis of the principles of our being, and attains its aim through the vision and possession of the truth. In practice, it means if you keep getting angry at people's anger, at some point you say it is such a futile, useless exercise. How is it helping you? So if you are thinking of that, you are practicing actually Sankhya without knowing it. It's a form of yoga. You realize it's meaningless. Try it, then you can realize something at yet greater level. This is about the bad side of it, the good side. How much ever you explain, the fellow doesn't understand. So again you realize that it doesn't help because he is bound by his nature. Though the Gita will explain that much later, how nature binds us. So it says that the Gita insists, Yoga, on the other hand, proceeds by works. It is in its first principle karma yoga, but it is evident from the whole teaching of the Gita and its later definitions that the word karma is used in a very wide sense, and that by yoga is meant the selfless devotion of all the inner as well as outer activities as a sacrifice to the Lord of all works, offered to the Eternal as master of all the soul's energies and austerities. all the field, inner and outer. Later on, it will expand on this. Thought, feeling, everything is an action. See, it is so different from the Western idea of goodness. That is manners. You should be well behaved. You may be very well behaved, and yet you may sport an artificial smile to cheat people. It's not about being well behaved and well mannerly. It's about being inwardly in a state of goodness, in a state of truth, in a state of love, in a state of harmony. So that's exactly what the Gita teaches us, that yoga proceeds by work and it uses the entire inner and outer field. But what we have to do it is selfless devotion of all the inner as well as outer activities as a sacrifice to the Lord of all works. This action, this thought, this feeling I dedicate to you. And with love, devotion. And then that activity is taken up by the Lord and He is responsible for the results, because it's offered to the Eternal as master of all the soul's energies and austerities. Yoga is the practice of the truth, of which knowledge gives the vision. That's why knowledge is important. So he resolves Arjuna's dilemma. I am not saying two things. I am not speaking of the way of sannyas as a means of attaining knowledge. I am speaking of tyaga, wherein while doing works, what we have to do, tyaga of the ego and the desired self. That is the crux of the whole teaching. And how to start? Later on it will elaborate, nishkam karma, etc. But renounce these two things. Don't act under the impulsions of the ego and for the sake of fulfillment of desire. So if we can remember this, so act as an offering to the divine based on whatever our highest state of buddhi can show us at a given point of time, and dedicate it to the eternal. Now if we practice it, the knowledge will begin to awaken within us. So it teaches tyaga, renunciation, and not sannyasa, asceticism. And its practice has for its motor power a spirit of illumined devotion. So there is in it bhakti, but it should be illumined devotion. See, the Gita has anticipated how people are going to become fanatics and fundamentalists. In the name of God, they will commit the worst crimes. So it speaks of illumined devotion, of calm or fervent consecration to that which knowledge sees to be the highest. It leaves that highest may be Krishna, Rama, the one self, Shri Aurobindo and the mother. Dedicate to that. What a vast and Catholic spirit in the Gita. And then there is this is what we read, but worth reading again. For evidently there are two possibilities of the action of the intelligent will. It may take its downward and outward orientation towards a discursive action of the perceptions, and the will in the triple play of the Prakriti. This is what happens most of the time. Look at it, simple discussion. It starts from maybe whatever and ends up with food, ends up with gossip, ends up with newspaper. Discursive intellect. There is no focus even of what we are really talking about. To this degree our intellect is discursive. Or it may take its upward and inward orientation towards a subtle peace and equality in the calm and immutable purity of the conscious silent soul, no longer subject to the distractions of nature. In the former alternative, the subjective being is at the mercy of the objects of senses. Subjective being is the self. It is at the mercy of the objects of the senses. That life, it lives in the outward contact of things. That life is the life of desire. For the senses, excited by their objects, create a restless or often violent disturbance. A strong or even headlong outward movement toward the seizure of these objects. Its extreme tendency is possess. I want to possess it outwardly. Seizure of these objects and their enjoyment. And they carry away the sense mind as the winds carry away a ship upon the sea. And where it can go, to what ditch or abyss it can fall, in what whirlpool the mind may get caught. It is both dangerous and frightening to see that. The mind, so the Gita has taught us what you are not supposed to do. If you get drawn into that sense mind, this is what is going to happen. The mind subjected to the emotions, passions, longings, impulsions awakened by this outward movement of the senses carries away similarly the intelligent will, which loses therefore its power of calm discrimination and mastery. That is the difference between love and attachment, incidentally. Love is a beautiful inner state. It can express itself in countless ways. But when it is only about senses, trying to possess an object, then love becomes the dirtiest and ugliest that we can ever imagine. Subjection of the soul to the confused play of the three gunas of Prakriti. So what happens? Suddenly one is driven by rajas. I'll do it, I must do this, I must do that to have my object of desire. After some time there is exhaustion. Or when you hold it, you realize it's not giving me the joy. So there is tamas. Or there is the sattva awakening for some time telling you, no, this is not the approach. What is the use? Again one is driven by the rajas, again the tamas. So that way one keeps on rolling within the wheel. Eternal entangled twining and the wrestling, ignorance, a false, sensuous, objective life of the soul. Oh, if you ask people, how was life like? Oh, it was wonderful. I went there, I saw this, I saw that. Ask a person who is awakened, what was it like? He will give a very different description. Same thing. Pondicherry was so wonderful. Nice wine, nice food shops. It was so nice. Only crowd was a little more, weather was a little hot. This will be the description of the sensuous man driven by desires. Ask somebody who is living in the subjective inner being. You say, Samadhi was so wonderful, so peaceful I felt. Because what is, you are driven by outward. The other is where you sense that inner touch. Enslavement to grief and wrath and attachment and passion are the results of the downward trend of the buddhi. The troubled life of the ordinary, unenlightened, undisciplined man. Those who, like the Vedvadins, make sense enjoyment the object of action and its fulfillment the highest aim of the soul are misleading guides. He's used the word guides. There are people who say that. Doesn't matter. Eat, drink and be merry. That's life is about that. See, misleading guides. The inner subjective self-delight, independent of objects, is our true aim and the high and wide poise of our peace and liberation. Therefore, it is the upward and inward orientation of the intelligent will that we must resolutely choose with a settled concentration and perseverance. He gives us the method. Settled concentration and perseverance. The mind will again and again turn away. Bring it back. It will again go away. Bring it back. Vyavasaya, we must fix it firmly in the calm self-knowledge of the Purusha. The first movement must be to thoroughly get rid of desire, which is the whole root of the evil and suffering. And in order to get rid of desire, we must put an end to the cause of desire. What is the cause of desire? The rushing out of the senses to seize and enjoy their objects. That is the cause of desire. It wrongly believes, it's a ignorance that if I get it outwardly, I get it. You may get it outwardly and it will be a corpse. That's it. So that's not the movement. Joy is not banned, but not this way. True joy is the joy of the soul. And when it is in that state, it can enjoy everything. We must draw them back when they are inclined thus to rush out. Draw them away from their objects as the tortoise draws in his limbs into the shell. So these into their souls, quiescent in the mind quiescent in intelligence, the intelligence quiescent in the soul and its self-knowledge. Observing the action of nature, but not subject to it. Not desiring anything that the objective life can give. It is not an external asceticism. The physical renunciation of the objects of sense that I am teaching, suggests Krishna, immediately to avoid a misunderstanding. Not the renunciation of the Sankhyas or the austerities of the rigid ascetic with its fasts, his maceration of the body, his attempt to abstain even from food. That is not the self-discipline or the abstinence which I mean. For I speak of an inner withdrawal, a renunciation of desire. And then he says, this cannot be done perfectly by the act of the intelligence itself, by a merely mental self-discipline. It can only be done by yoga with something which is higher than itself, and in which calm and self-mastery are inherent. And here comes that final word of these first 6 chapters. And this yoga can only arrive at its success by devoting, by consecrating, by giving up the whole self to the divine. To me, says Krishna. For the liberator is within us, but it is not our mind, nor our intelligence, nor our personal will. They are only instruments. So you see, in the first 6 chapters, we'll see there is knowledge, yoga of the intelligent will. There is karma, tyaga and not sannyasa, and there is bhakti, consecrated finally to me. So we see all these 3 seeds which will be developed. This is the sense of the phrase, he must sit firm in yoga, wholly given up to me. It's not sit like this. The inner asana in yoga. But as yet it is the merest passing hint after the manner of the Gita, 3 words only which contain in seed the whole gist of the highest secret yet to be developed. Yukta sita matpara. If this is done, then it is possible to move among the objects of senses, in contact with them, acting on them, but with the senses entirely under the control of the subjective self. So this highest secret he reveals as, Sarva Dharman Parityaja. But this is the kernel. Start with this. And then he says, what happens when you do this? You escape from the duality of positive and negative desire, and calm, peace, clearness, happy tranquility, Atma Prasad will settle upon the man. That clear tranquility is the source of the soul's felicity. And it is this to which the Gita gives the name of Samadhi. So Arjuna says, sir, wonderful. But tell me, how does that man act? How does he speak? Is it that he will speak only Sanskrit? Or is it that he will speak very good English? How will he act? Is it that he will not eat anything? Is it like he will always wear a particular form of dress, a particular color of dress? How does such a man look like, act, speak, etc.? The sign of the man in Samadhi is not that he loses consciousness of objects and surroundings, and of his mental and physical self, and cannot be recalled to it even by burning or torture of the body, the ordinary idea of the matter. Trance is a particular intensity, not the essential sign. The test is the expulsion of all desires. He is a free man inside. Their inability to get at the mind, and it is the inner state from which this freedom arises, the delight of the soul. So he says this sign is inward. You cannot know by any outward sign. He is sitting deep in meditation, absorbed in trance. On a particular day, he will open his eyes and no. Arjuna is a karma yogin, fighting the great battle, of course, real battle, not just inner battle. But he is the master. That's how Shri Krishna trains and teaches him. Arjuna, voicing the average human mind, asks for some outward, physically, practically discernible sign of this great Samadhi. How does such a man speak? How sit? How walk? No such signs can be given. Nor does the teacher attempt to supply them. And see how far-reaching this is. Till today, within India, we talk of Gita. And the moment somebody comes in a saffron cloth, we say, oh, Guruji aa gaye. One has to just put a Guruji before his name. And if you can put little more epithets. When somebody asks the mother that this life of Sri Aurobindo, shall we put, this what life of Sri Aurobindo sounds so bland. Shall we put seer or Mahayogi? Mother said, no, only Sri Aurobindo. No. They are limiting him. Seer Sri Aurobindo, Mahayogi Sri Aurobindo, Shuddha Sri Aurobindo. Only Shri Krishna. You don't, it sounds very odd. Suddenly you feel him distanced. A sign of yoga is inside and nothing in outward. No such sign can be given. For the only possible test of its position is inward. And that equality is the great stamp of the liberated soul. And of that equality, even the most discernible signs are still subjective. How do you know the equality of the soul? Equality is the great stamp. A man with mind untroubled by sorrows, who is done with desire for pleasures, from whom liking and wrath and fear have passed away. He's not afraid. There's no particular liking. Oh, people who flatter me, they are very good people. Oh, today a politician has called me, I must go there and so nice to have a photograph. No such thing will be there. Wrath, anger, fear, all this pass away from such a person. Such is the sage whose understanding has become founded in stability. He is without the triple action of the qualities of the Prakriti. He acts through them, but he is above them. Trigunatit. Fixed in yoga, do thy actions, having abandoned attachment, having become equal in failure and success. For it is equality that is meant by yoga. Action is distressed by the choice between a relative good and evil. What a wonderful language. Distressed. Should I do this? This is good. This evil. The fear of sin and the difficult endeavor towards virtue. This should not be sin and virtue. Compassion, yes. Divine will, yes. Love, yes. But not, if I do this is a sinful act, I will rot in hell. If I do this, my name will be written among the virtuous. That should not distress the choice. But the liberated who has united his reason and will with the divine, casts away from him, even here in this world of dualities, both good doing and evil doing. For he rises to a higher law beyond good and evil, founded in the liberty of self-knowledge. Such desireless action can have no decisiveness, no effectiveness, no efficient motive, no large or vigorous creative power, question mark. Now imagine, if somebody just misses this question mark and quotes the Gita. Shubhendra says, you mean to say that such an action will have no force, no motive, no vigorous creative power? Not so. Action done in yoga is not only the highest, but the wisest, the most potent and efficient even for the affairs of the world. For it is informed by the knowledge and will of the master of works. Yoga is skill in works. That's what is meant by yoga karma sukashlam. But all action directed towards life leads away from the universal aim of the yogin, which is by common consent to escape from bondage to this distressed and sorrowful human birth. Again a question mark. Sri Krishna says, not so. The sages who do works without desire for fruits and in yoga with the divine are liberated from the bondage of birth and reach that other perfect status in which there are none of the maladies which afflict the mind and life of a suffering humanity. And that status is the Brahmi Sthiti, which the Gita speaks of. Thus, finally, this first part ends. Such subtly unifying Sankhya, Yoga and Vedanta. And he says this is the Nirvana, Brahma Nirvana. Thus, subtly unifying Sankhya, Yoga and Vedanta is the first foundation of the teaching of the Gita. It is far from being all, but it is the first indispensable practical unity of knowledge and works, with a hint already of the third crowning intensest element in the soul's completeness, divine love and devotion.